Part II-A of Auguste Comte and Positivism. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Auguste Comte and Positivism, by John Stuart Mill. Part II-A. The later speculations of M. Comte. Footnote 1. Système de politique positive ou traité de sociologie instituant la religion de l'humanité. 4 volumes. Paris, 1851–1854. 2. Catéchisme positiviste ou sommaire exposition de la religion universelle en 11 entretiens systématiques entre une femme et un prêtre de l'humanité. 1 volume. Paris, 1852. 3. Appel aux conservateurs. Paris, 1855. Brochure. 4. Synthèse subjective ou système universel des conceptions propres à l'état normal de l'humanité, tome 1er, contenant le système de logique positive ou traité de philosophie mathématique. Paris, 1856. 5. Auguste Comte et la philosophie positive, par I. Lettré. 1 volume. Paris, 1863. 6. Exposition abrégée et populaire de la philosophie et de la religion positive, par Célestin de Billonnière, ancien élève de l'École Polytechnique. 1 volume. Paris, 1857. 7. Notice sur l'œuvre et sur la vie d'Auguste Comte, par le docteur Robinet, son médecin, et l'un de ses 13 accusateurs testamentaires. 1 volume. Paris, 1860. End footnote. The appended list of publications contain the materials for knowing and estimating what M. Comte termed his second career, in which the savant, historian, and philosopher of his fundamental treatise came forth transfigured as the high priest of the religion of humanity. They include all his writings except the Cours de philosophique positive. For his early productions, and the occasional publications of his later life, are reprinted as preludes or appendices to the treatises here enumerated, or in Dr. Robinet's volume, which, as well as that of M. Lettré, also contains copious extracts from his correspondence. In the concluding pages of his great systematic work, M. Comte had announced 4 other treatises as in contemplation: on politics, on the philosophy of mathematics, on education, a project subsequently enlarged to include the systematization of morals, and on industry, or the action of man upon external nature. Our list comprises the only 2 of these which he lived to execute. It further contains a brief exposition of his final doctrines, in the form of a dialogue, or, as he terms it, a catechism, of which a translation has been published by his principal English adherent, Mr. Congreve. There has also appeared very recently, under the title of A General View of Positivism, a translation by Dr. Bridges of the preliminary discourse in 6 chapters, prefixed to the Système de politique positive. The remaining 3 books on our list are the productions of disciples in different degrees. M. Lettré, the only thinker of established reputation who accepts that character, is a disciple only of the Cours de philosophie positive, and can see the weak points even in that. Some of them he has discriminated and discussed with great judgment, and the merits of his volume, both as a sketch of M. Comte's life and an appreciation of his doctrines, would well deserve a fuller notice than we are able to give it here. M. de Bellinière is a far more thorough adherent, so much so that the reader of his singularly well and attractively written condensation and popularization of his master's doctrines does not easily discover in what it falls short of that unqualified acceptance which alone, it would seem, could find favour with M. Comte. For he ended by casting off M. de Blignières, as he had previously cast off M. Littré, and every other person who, having gone with him a certain length, refused to follow him to the end. The author of the last work in our enumeration, Dr. Robinet, is a disciple after M. Comte's own heart, one whom no difficulty stops, and no absurdity startles. But it is far from our disposition to speak otherwise than respectfully of Dr. Robinet and the other earnest men, who maintained round the tomb of their master an organized co-operation for the diffusion of doctrines which they believed destined to regenerate the human race. Their enthusiastic veneration for him, and devotion to the ends he pursued, do honor alike to them and to their teacher, and are an evidence of the personal ascendancy he exercised over those who approached him, an ascendancy which for a time carried away even M. Littré, as he confesses, to a length which his calmer judgment does not now approve. These various writings raise many points of interest regarding M. Comte's personal history, and some, not without philosophic bearings, respecting his mental habits. From all which matters we shall abstain, with the exception of two, which he himself proclaimed with great emphasis, and a knowledge of which is almost indispensable to an apprehension of the characteristic difference between his second career and his first. It should be known that during his later life, and even before completing his first great treatise, M. Comte adopted a rule, to which he very rarely made any exception, to abstain systematically not only from newspapers or periodical publications, even scientific, but from all reading whatever, except a few favourite poets in the ancient and modern European languages. This abstinence he practised for the sake of mental health, by way, as he said, of hygiène cérébrale. We are far from thinking that the practice has nothing whatever to recommend it. For most thinkers, doubtless, it would be a very unwise one. But we will not affirm that it may not sometimes be advantageous to a mind of the peculiar quality of M. Comte's, one that can usefully devote itself to following out to the remotest developments a particular line of meditations, of so arduous a kind that the complete concentration of the intellect upon its own thoughts is almost a necessary condition of success. When a mind of this character has laboriously and conscientiously laid in beforehand, as M. Comte had done, an ample stock of materials, he may be justified in thinking that he will contribute most to the mental wealth of mankind by occupying himself solely in working upon these, without distracting his attention by continually taking in more matter, or keeping a communication open with other independent intellects. The practice, therefore, may be legitimate, but no one should adopt it without being aware of what he loses by it. He must resign the pretension of arriving at the whole truth on the subject, whatever it be, of his meditations. That he should effect this, even on a narrow subject, by the mere force of his own mind, building on the foundations of his predecessors, without aid or correction from his contemporaries, is simply impossible. He may do eminent service by elaborating certain sides of the truth, but he must expect to find that there are other sides which have wholly escaped his attention. However great his powers, everything that he can do without the aid of incessant remindings from other thinkers is merely provisional, and will require a thorough revision. He ought to be aware of this, and accept it with his eyes open, regarding himself as a pioneer, not a constructor. If he thinks that he can contribute most towards the elements of the final synthesis by following out his own original thoughts as far as they will go, leaving to other thinkers, or to himself, at a subsequent time, the business of adjusting them to the thoughts by which they ought to be accompanied, he is right in doing so. But he deludes himself if he imagines that any conclusions he can arrive at while he practices M. Comte's rule of hygiène cérébrale can possibly be definitive. Neither is such a practice, in a hygienic point of view, free from the gravest dangers to the philosopher's own mind. When once he has persuaded himself that he can work out the final truth on any subject, exclusively from his own sources, he is apt to lose all measure or standard by which to be apprised when he is departing from common sense. Living only with his own thoughts, he gradually forgets the aspect they present to minds of a different mould from his own. He looks at his conclusions only from the point of view which suggested them, and from which they naturally appear perfect; and every consideration which from other points of view might present itself, either as an objection or as a necessary modification, is to him as if it did not exist. When his merits come to be recognized and appreciated, and especially if he obtains disciples, the intellectual infirmity soon becomes complicated with a moral one. The natural result of the position is a gigantic self-confidence, not to say self-conceit. That of M. Comte is colossal. Except here and there in an entirely self-taught thinker, who has no high standard with which to compare himself, we have met with nothing approaching to it. As his thoughts grew more extravagant, his self-confidence grew more outrageous. The height it ultimately attained must be seen in his writings to be believed. The other circumstance of personal nature which it is impossible not to notice, because M. Comte is perpetually referring to it as the origin of the great superiority which he ascribes to his later as compared with his earlier speculations, is the moral regeneration which he underwent from une angélique influence and une incomparable passion privée. He formed a passionate attachment to a lady whom he describes as uniting everything which is morally with much that is intellectually admirable, and his relation to whom, besides the direct influence of her character upon his own, gave him an insight into the true sources of human happiness, which changed his whole conception of life. This attachment, which always remained pure, gave him but 1 year of passionate enjoyment, the lady having been cut off by death at the end of that short period. But the adoration of her memory survived, and became, as we shall see, the type of his conception of the sympathetic culture proper for all human beings. The change thus effected in his personal character and sentiments manifested itself at once in his speculations, which, from having been only a philosophy, now aspired to become a religion, and from having been as purely and almost rudely scientific and intellectual, as was compatible with a character always enthusiastic in its admirations and in its ardour for improvement, became from this time what, for want of a better name, may be called sentimental, but sentimental in a way of its own, very curious to contemplate. In considering the system of religion, politics, and morals, which in his later writings M. Comte constructed, it is not unimportant to bear in mind the nature of the personal experience and inspiration to which he himself constantly attributed this phasis of his philosophy. But as we shall have much more to say against, than in favour of, the conclusions to which he was in this manner conducted, it is right to declare that, from the evidence of his writings, we really believe the moral influence of Madame Clotilde de Vaux upon his character to have been of the ennobling as well as softening character which he ascribes to it. Making allowance for the effects of his exuberant growth and self-conceit, we perceive almost as much improvement in his feelings as deterioration in his speculations, compared with those of the Philosophie Positive. Even the speculations are, in some secondary aspects, improved through the beneficial effect of the improved feelings, and might have been more so, if, by a rare good fortune, the object of his attachment had been qualified to exercise as improving an influence over him intellectually as morally, and if he could have been contented with something less ambitious than being the supreme moral legislator and religious pontiff of the human race. When we say that M. Comte has erected his philosophy into a religion, the word religion must not be understood in its ordinary sense. He made no change in the purely negative attitude which he maintained towards theology. His religion is without a God. In saying this, we have done enough to induce 9/10 of all readers, at least in our own country, to avert their faces and close their ears. To have no religion, though scandalous enough, is an idea they are partly used to; but to have no God, and to talk of religion, is, to their feelings, at once an absurdity and an impiety. Of the remaining 10th, a great proportion, perhaps, will turn away from anything which calls itself by the name of religion at all. Between the two, it is difficult to find an audience who can be induced to listen to M. Comte without an insurmountable prejudice. But to be just to any opinion, it ought to be considered, not exclusively from an opponent's point of view, but from that of the mind which propounds it. Though conscious of being in an extremely small minority, we venture to think that a religion may exist without belief in a God, and that a religion without a God may be, even to Christians, an instructive and profitable object of contemplation. What, in truth, are the conditions necessary to constitute a religion? There must be a creed, or conviction, claiming authority over the whole of human life; a belief, or set of beliefs, deliberately adopted, respecting human destiny and duty, to which the believer inwardly acknowledges that all his actions ought to be subordinate. Moreover, there must be a sentiment connected with this creed, or capable of being invoked by it, sufficiently powerful to give it, in fact, the authority over human conduct to which it lays claim in theory. It is a great advantage, though not absolutely indispensable, that this sentiment should crystallize, as it were, round a concrete object, if possible a really existing one, though, in all the more important cases, only ideally present. Such an object Theism and Christianity offer to the believer, but the condition may be fulfilled, if not in a manner strictly equivalent, by another object. It has been said that whoever believes in the infinite nature of duty, even if he believes in nothing else, is religious. M. Comte believes in what is meant by the infinite nature of duty, but he refers the obligations of duty, as well as all sentiments of devotion, to a concrete object, at once ideal and real. The human race conceived as a continuous whole, including the past, the present, and the future. This great collective existence, this grand être, as he terms it, though the feelings it can excite are necessarily very different from those which direct themselves towards an ideally perfect being, has, as he forcibly urges, this advantage in respect to us, that it really needs our services, which omnipotence cannot, in any genuine sense of the term, be supposed to do. And M. Comte says that, assuming the existence of a supreme providence, which he is as far from denying as from affirming, the best, and even the only way in which we can rightly worship or serve him, is by doing our utmost to love and serve that other great being whose inferior providence has bestowed on us all the benefits that we owe to the labours and virtues of former generations. It may not be consonant to usage to call this a religion, but the term so applied has a meaning, and one which is not adequately expressed by any other word. Candid persons of all creeds may be willing to admit that if a person has an ideal object, his attachment and sense of duty towards which are able to control and discipline all his other sentiments and propensities, and prescribe to him a rule of life, that person has a religion. And though every one naturally prefers his own religion to any other, all must admit that if the object of this attachment, and of this feeling of duty, is the aggregate of our fellow creatures, this religion of the infidel cannot, in honesty and conscience, be called an intrinsically bad one. Many, indeed, may be unable to believe that this object is capable of gathering round it feelings sufficiently strong, but this is exactly the point on which a doubt can hardly remain in an intelligent reader of M. Comte, and we join with him in contemning, as equally irrational and mean, the conception of human nature as incapable of giving its love and devoting its existence to any object which cannot afford in exchange an eternity of personal enjoyment. The power which may be acquired over the mind by the idea of the general interest of the human race, both as a source of emotion and as a motive to conduct, many have perceived, but we know not if any one before M. Comte realized so fully as he has done all the majesty of which that idea is susceptible. It ascends into the unknown recesses of the past, embraces the manifold present, and descends into the indefinite and unforeseeable future, forming a collective existence without assignable beginning or end. It appeals to that feeling of the infinite which is deeply rooted in human nature, and which seems necessary to the imposingness of all our highest conceptions. Of the vast unrolling web of human life, the part best known to us is irrevocably past. This we can no longer serve, but can still love. It comprises for most of us the far greater number of those who have loved us, or from whom we have received benefits, as well as the long series of those who, by their labours and sacrifices for mankind, have deserved to be held in everlasting and grateful remembrance. As M. Comte truly says, the highest minds, even now, live in thought with the great dead, far more than with the living; and next to the dead, with those ideal human beings yet to come, whom they are never destined to see. If we honour as we ought those who have served mankind in the past, we shall feel that we are also working for those benefactors by serving that to which their lives were devoted. And when reflection, guided by history, has taught us the intimacy of the connection of every age of humanity with every other, making us see in the earthly destiny of mankind the playing out of a great drama, or the action of a prolonged epic, all the generations of mankind become indissolubly united into a single image, combining all the power over the mind of the idea of posterity with our best feelings toward the living world which surrounds us, and towards the predecessors who have made us what we are. That the ennobling power of this grand conception may have its full efficacy, we should, with M. Comte, regard the grand être, humanity, or mankind, as composed in the past solely of those who, in every age and variety of position, have played their part worthily in life. It is only as thus restricted that the aggregate of our species becomes an object deserving our veneration. The unworthy members of it are best dismissed from our habitual thoughts, and the imperfections which adhered through life, even to those of the dead who deserve honourable remembrance, should be no further borne in mind than is necessary not to falsify our conception of facts. On the other hand, the grand être, in its completeness, ought to include not only all whom we venerate, but all sentient beings to which we owe duties, and which have a claim on our attachment. M. Comte, therefore, incorporates into the ideal object whose service is to be the law of our life, not our own species exclusively, but, in a subordinate degree, our humble auxiliaries, those animal races which enter into real society with man, which attach themselves to him, and voluntarily co-operate with him, like the noble dog who gives his life for his human friend and benefactor. For this M. Comte has been subjected to unworthy ridicule, but there is nothing truer or more honourable to him in the whole body of his doctrines. The strong sense he always shows of the worth of the inferior animals, and of the duties of mankind towards them, is one of the very finest traits of his character. We therefore not only hold that M. Comte was justified in the attempt to develop his philosophy into a religion, and had realized the essential conditions of one, but that all other religions are made better in proportion as, in their practical result, they are brought to coincide with that which he aimed at constructing. But, unhappily, the next thing we are obliged to do is to charge him with making a complete mistake at the very outset of his operations, with fundamentally misconceiving the proper office of a rule of life. He committed the error which is often, but falsely, charged against the whole class of utilitarian moralists. He required that the test of conduct should also be the exclusive motive to it, because the good of the human race is the ultimate standard of right and wrong, and because moral discipline consists in cultivating the utmost possible repugnance to all conduct injurious to the general good. M. Comte infers that the good of others is the only inducement on which we should allow ourselves to act, and that we should endeavour to starve the whole of the desires which point to our personal satisfaction, by denying them all gratification not strictly required by physical necessities. The golden rule of morality in M. Comte's religion is to live for others, vivre pour autrui. To do as we would be done by, and to love our neighbour as ourself, are not sufficient for him. They partake, he thinks, of the nature of personal calculations. We should endeavour not to love ourselves at all. We shall not succeed in it, but we should make the nearest approach to it possible. Nothing less will satisfy him, as towards humanity, than the sentiment which one of his favourite writers, Thomas à Kempis, addresses to God: Amem te plus quam me, nec me nisi propter te. All education and all moral discipline should have but one object: to make altruism, a word of his own coming, predominate over egoism. If by this were only meant that egoism is bound, and should be taught, always to give way to the well understood interests of enlarged altruism, no one who acknowledges any morality at all would object to the proposition. But M. Comte, taking his stand on the biological fact that organs are strengthened by exercise and atrophied by disuse, and firmly convinced that each of our elementary inclinations has its distinct cerebral organ, thinks it the grand duty of life not only to strengthen the social affections by constant habit and by referring all our actions to them, but as far as possible to deaden the personal passions and propensities by desuetude. Even the exercise of the intellect is required to obey as an authoritative rule the dominion of the social feelings over the intelligence, du cœur sur l'esprit. The physical and other personal instincts are to be mortified far beyond the demands of bodily health, which indeed the morality of the future is not to insist much upon, for fear of encouraging les calculs personnels. M. Comte condemns only such austerities as, by diminishing the vigour of the constitution, make us less capable of being useful to others. Any indulgence, even in food, not necessary to health and strength, he condemns as immoral. All gratifications except those of the affections are to be tolerated only as inevitable infirmities. Novalis said of Spinoza that he was a God-intoxicated man. M. Comte is a morality-intoxicated man. Every question with him is one of morality, and no motive but that of morality is permitted. End of Part 2a. Recording by Bill Borst. Part 2b of Auguste Comte and Positivism. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Auguste Comte and Positivism, by John Stuart Mill. Part 2b. The explanation of this we find in an original mental twist very common in French thinkers, and by which M. Comte was distinguished beyond them all. He could not dispense with what he called unity. It was for the sake of unity that a religion was, in his eyes, desirable. Not in the mere sense of unanimity, but in a far wider one. A religion must be something by which to systematize human life. His definition of it, in the Catechism, is the state of complete unity which distinguishes our existence, at once personal and social, when all its parts, both moral and physical, converge habitually to a common destination. Such a harmony, individual and collective, being incapable of complete realization in an existence so complicated as ours, this definition of religion characterizes the immovable type towards which tends more and more the aggregate of human efforts. Our happiness and our merit consist especially in approaching as near as possible to this unity, of which the gradual increase constitutes the best measures of real improvement, personal or social. To this theme he continually returns, and argues that this unity or harmony among all the elements of our life is not consistent with the predominance of the personal propensities, since these drag us in different directions. It can only result from the subordination of them all to the social islings, which may be made to act in a uniform direction by a common system of convictions, and which differ from the personal inclinations in this, that we all naturally encourage them in one another, while on the contrary social life is a perpetual restraint upon the selfish propensities. The fons errorum in M. Comte's later speculations is this inordinate demand for unity and systematization. This is the reason why it does not suffice to him that all should be ready, in case of need, to postpone their personal interests and inclinations to the requirements of the general good. He demands that each should regard as vicious any care at all for his personal interests, except as a means to the good of others, should be ashamed of it, should strive to cure himself of it, because his existence is not systematized, is not in complete unity, as long as he cares for more than one thing. The strangest part of the matter is, that this doctrine seems to M. Comte to be axiomatic. That all perfection consists in unity, he apparently considers to be a maxim which no sane man thinks of questioning. It never seems to enter into his conceptions that any one could object ab initio, and ask, why this universal systematizing? Why is it necessary that all human life should point to but one object, and be cultivated into a system of means to a single end? May it not be the fact that mankind, who after all are made up of single human beings, obtain a greater sum of happiness when each pursues his own, under the rules and conditions required by the good of the rest, than when each makes the good of the rest his only subject, and allows himself no personal pleasures not indispensable to the preservation of his faculties? The regimen of a blockaded town should be cheerfully submitted to when high purposes require it, but is it the ideal perfection of human existence? M. Comte sees none of these difficulties. The only true happiness, he affirms, is in the exercise of the affections. He had found it so for a whole year, which was enough to enable him to get to the bottom of the question, and to judge whether he could do without everything else. Of course the supposition was not to be heard of that any other person could require, or be the better for, what M. Comte did not value. Unity and systematization absolutely demanded that all other people should model themselves after M. Comte. It would never do to suppose that there could be more than one road to human happiness, or more than one ingredient in it. The most prejudiced must admit that this religion without theology is not chargeable with relaxation of moral restraints. On the contrary, it prodigiously exaggerates them. It makes the same ethical mistake as the theory of Calvinism, that every act in life should be done for the glory of God, and that whatever is not a duty is a sin. It does not perceive that between the region of duty and that of sin there is an intermediate space, the region of positive worthiness. It is not good that persons should be bound by other people's opinion to do everything that they would deserve praise for doing. There is a standard of altruism to which all should be required to come up, and a degree beyond it which is not obligatory but meritorious. It is incumbent on every one to restrain the pursuit of his personal objects within the limits consistent with the essential interests of others. What those limits are, it is the province of ethical science to determine, and to keep all individuals and aggregations of individuals within them is the proper office of punishment and of moral blame. If in addition to fulfilling this obligation, persons make the good of others a direct object of disinterested exertions, postponing or sacrificing to it even innocent personal indulgences, they deserve gratitude and honor, and are fit objects of moral praise, so long as they are in no way compelled to this conduct by any external pressure. There cannot be too much of it. But a necessary condition is its spontaneity, since the notion of a happiness for all, procured by the self-sacrifice of each, if the abnegation is really felt to be a sacrifice, is a contradiction. Such spontaneity by no means excludes sympathetic encouragement, but the encouragement should take the form of making self-devotion pleasant, not that of making everything else painful. The object should be to stimulate services to humanity by their natural rewards, not to render the pursuit of our own good in any other manner impossible by visiting it with the reproaches of other and of our own conscience. The proper office of these sanctions is to enforce upon every one the conduct necessary to give all other persons their fair chance, conduct which chiefly consists in not doing them harm, and not impeding them in anything which, without harming others, does good to themselves. To this must of course be added, that when we either expressly or tacitly undertake to do more, we are bound to keep our promise, and inasmuch as every one who avails himself of the advantages of society leads others to expect from him all such positive good offices and disinterested services as the moral improvement attained by mankind has rendered customary, he deserves moral blame if, without just cause, he disappoints that expectation. Through this principle the domain of moral duty is always widening. When what once was uncommon virtue becomes common virtue, it comes to be numbered among obligations, while a degree exceeding what has grown common remains simply meritorious. M. Comte is accustomed to draw most of his ideas of moral cultivation from the discipline of the Catholic Church. Had he followed that guidance in the present case, he would have been less wide of the mark. For the distinction which we have drawn was fully recognized by the sagacious and far-sighted men who created the Catholic ethics. It is even one of the stock reproaches against Catholicism that it has two standards of morality, and does not make obligatory on all Christians the highest rule of Christian perfection. It has one standard which, faithfully acted up to, suffices for salvation, another, and a higher, which, when realized, constitutes a saint. M. Comte, perhaps unconsciously, for there is nothing that he would have been more unlikely to do if he had been aware of it, has taken a leaf out of the book of the despised Protestantism. Like the extreme Calvinists, he requires that all believers shall be saints, and damns then, after his own fashion, if they are not. Our conception of human life is different. We do not conceive life to be so rich in enjoyments that it can afford to forego the cultivation of all those which address themselves to what M. Comte terms the egoistic propensities. On the contrary, we believe that a sufficient gratification of these, short of excess, but up to the measure which renders the enjoyment greatest, is almost always favourable to the benevolent affections. The moralization of the personal enjoyments we deem to consist, not in reducing them to the smallest possible amount, but in cultivating the habitual wish to share them with others, and with all others, and scorning to desire anything for oneself which is incapable of being so shared. There is only one passion or inclination which is permanently incompatible with this condition: the love of domination, or superiority, for its own sake, which implies, and is grounded on, the equivalent depression of other people. As a rule of conduct, to be enforced by moral sanctions, we think no more should be attempted than to prevent people from doing harm to others, or omitting to do such good as they have undertaken. Demanding no more than this, society, in any tolerable circumstances, obtains much more. For the natural activity of human nature, shut out from all noxious directions, will expand itself in useful ones. This is our conception of the moral rule prescribed by the religion of humanity. But above this standard there is an unlimited range of moral worth, up to the most exalted heroism, which should be fostered by every positive encouragement, though not converted into an obligation. It is as much a part of our scheme as of M. Comte's that the direct cultivation of altruism, and the subordination of egoism to it, far beyond the point of absolute moral duty, should be one of the chief aims of education, both individual and collective. We even recognize the value, for this end, of ascetic discipline, in the original Greek sense of the word. We think with Dr. Johnson that he who has never denied himself anything which is not wrong, cannot be fully trusted for denying himself everything which is so. We do not doubt that children and young persons will one day be again systematically disciplined in self-mortification, that they will be taught, as in antiquity, to control their appetites, to brave dangers and submit voluntarily to pain, as simple exercises in education. Something has been lost as well as gained by no longer giving to every citizen the training necessary for a soldier. Nor can any pains taken be too great to form the habit and develop the desire of being useful to others and to the world, by the practice, independently of reward and of every personal consideration, of positive virtue beyond the bounds of prescribed duty. No efforts should be spared to associate the pupil's self-respect and his desire of the respect of others with service rendered to humanity; when possible, collectively, but at all events, what is always possible, in the persons of its individual members. There are many remarks and precepts in M. Comte's volumes which, as no less pertinent to our conception of morality than to his, we fully accept. For example, without admitting that to make calculs personnels is contrary to morality, we agree with him in the opinion that the principal hygienic precepts should be inculcated not solely or principally as maxims of prudence, but as a matter of duty to others, since by squandering our health we disable ourselves from rendering to our fellow creatures the services to which they are entitled. As M. Comte truly says, the prudential motive is by no means fully sufficient for the purpose, even physicians often disregarding their own precepts. The personal penalties of neglect of health are commonly distant, as well as more or less uncertain, and require the additional and more immediate sanction of moral responsibility. M. Comte, therefore, in this instance, is, we conceive, right in principle, though we have not the smallest doubt that he would have gone into extreme exaggeration in practice, and would have wholly ignored the legitimate liberty of the individual to judge for himself respecting his own bodily conditions, with due relation to the sufficiency of his means of knowledge, and taking the responsibility of the result. Connected with the same considerations is another idea of M. Comte, which has great beauty and grandeur in it, and the realization of which, within the bounds of possibility, would be a cultivation of the social feelings on a most essential point. It is that every person who lives by any useful work should be habituated to regard himself not as an individual working for his private benefit, but as a public functionary, and his wages, of whatever sort, as not the remuneration or purchase money of his labour, which should be given freely, but as the provision made by society to enable him to carry it on, and to replace the materials and products which have been consumed in the process. M. Comte observes that in modern industry every one in fact works much more for others than for himself, since his productions are to be consumed by others, and it is only necessary that his thoughts and imagination should adapt themselves to the real state of the fact. The practical problem, however, is not quite so simple, for a strong sense that he is working for others may lead to nothing better than feeling himself necessary to them, and instead of freely giving his commodity may only encourage him to put a high price upon it. What M. Comte really means is that we should regard working for the benefit of others as a good in itself, that we should desire it for its own sake, and not for the sake of remuneration, which cannot justly be claimed for doing what we like, that the proper return for a service to society is the gratitude of society, and that the moral claim of any one in regard to the provision for his personal wants is not a question of quid pro quo in respect to his co-operation, but of how much the circumstances of society permit to be assigned to him, consistently with the just claims of others. To this opinion we entirely subscribe. The rough method of settling the labourer's share of the produce, the competition of the market, may represent a practical necessity, but certainly not a moral ideal. Its defence is, that civilization has not hitherto been equal to organizing anything better than this first rude approach to an equitable distribution. Rude as it is, we for the present go less wrong by leaving the thing to settle itself, than by settling it artificially in any mode which has yet been tried. But in whatever manner that question may ultimately be decided, the true moral and social idea of labour is in no way affected by it. Until labourers and employers perform the work of industry in the spirit in which soldiers perform that of an army, industry will never be moralized, and military life will remain what, in spite of the anti-social character of its direct object, it has hitherto been, the chief school of moral co-operation. Thus far of the general idea of M. Comte's ethics and religion. We must now say something of the details. Here we approach the ludicrous side of the subject, but we shall unfortunately have to relate other things far more really ridiculous. There cannot be a religion without a cultus. We use this term for want of any other, for its nearest equivalent, worship, suggests a different order of ideas. We mean by it a set of systematic observances intended to cultivate and maintain the religious sentiment. Though M. Comte justly appreciates the superior efficacy of acts in keeping up and strengthening the feeling which prompts them, over any mode whatever of mere expression, he takes pains to organize the latter also with great minuteness. He provides an equivalent both for the private devotions and for the public ceremonies of other faiths. The reader will be surprised to learn that the former consists of prayer. But prayer, as understood by M. Comte, does not mean asking. It is a mere outpouring of feeling. And for this view of it he claims the authority of the Christian mystics. It is not to be addressed to the grand être, to collective humanity, though he occasionally carries metaphor so far as to style this a goddess. The honours to collective humanity are reserved for the public celebrations. Private adoration is to be addressed to it in the persons of worthy individual representatives, who may be either living or dead, but must in all cases be women. For women, being the ses amants, represent the best attribute of humanity, that which ought to regulate all human life, nor can humanity possibly be symbolized in any form but that of a woman. The objects of private adoration are the mother, the wife, and the daughter, representing severally the past, the present, and the future, and calling into active exercise the three social sentiments, veneration, attachment, and kindness. We are to regard them, whether dead or alive, as our guardian angels, les vrais anges gardiens. If the last two have never existed, or if, in the particular case, any of the three types is too faulty for the office assigned to it, their place may be supplied by some other type of womanly excellence, even by one merely historical. Be the object living or dead, the adoration, as we understand it, is to be addressed only to the idea. The prayer consists of two parts, a commemoration followed by an effusion. By a commemoration, M. Comte means an effort of memory and imagination, summoning up with the utmost possible vividness the image of the object, and every artifice is exhausted to render the image as lifelike, as close to the reality, as near an approach to actual hallucination as is consistent with sanity. This degree of intensity having been, as far as practicable, attained, the effusion follows. Every person should compose his own form of prayer, which should be repeated not mentally only, but orally, and may be added to or varied for sufficient cause, but never arbitrarily. It may be interspersed with passages from the best poets, when they present themselves spontaneously, as giving a felicitous expression to the adorer's own feeling. These observances M. Comte practised to the memory of his Clotilde, and he enjoins them on all true believers. They are to occupy 2 hours of every day, divided into 3 parts, at rising, in the middle of the working hours, and in bed at night. The first, which should be in a kneeling attitude, will be commonly the longest, and the second the shortest. The third is to be extended as nearly as possible to the moment of falling asleep, that its effect may be felt in disciplining even the dreams. The public cultus consists of a series of celebrations or festivals, 84 in the year, so arranged that at least one occurs in every week. They are devoted to the successive glorification of humanity itself, of the various ties, political and domestic, among mankind, of the successive stages in the past evolution of our species, and of the several classes into which M. Comte's polity divides mankind. M. Comte's religion has moreover 9 sacraments, consisting in the solemn consecration, by the priests of humanity, with appropriate exhortations, of all the great transitions in life, the entry into life itself and into each of its successive stages, education, marriage, the choice of a profession, and so forth. Among these is death, which receives the name of transformation, and is considered a passage from objective existence to subjective, to living in the memory of our fellow creatures. Having no eternity of objective existence to offer, M. Comte's religion gives it all he can, by holding out the hope of subjective immortality, of existing in the remembrance and in the posthumous adoration of mankind at large, if we have done anything to deserve remembrance from them; at all events, of those whom we loved during life, and when they too are gone, of being included in the collective adoration paid to the grand être. People are to be taught to look forward to this as a sufficient recompense for the devotion of a whole life to the service of humanity. 7 years after death comes the last sacrament, a public judgment, by the priesthood, on the memory of the defunct. This is not designed for purposes of reprobation, but of honor, and any one may, by declaration during life, exempt himself from it. If judged and found worthy, he is solemnly incorporated with the grand être, and his remains are transferred from the civil to the religious place of sepulture, le bois sacré qui doit entourer chaque temple de l'humanité. This brief abstract gives no idea of the minuteness of M. Comte's prescriptions, and the extraordinary height to which he carries the mania for regulation by which Frenchmen are distinguished among Europeans, and M. Comte among Frenchmen. It is this which throws an irresistible air of ridicule over the whole subject. There is nothing really ridiculous in the devotional practices which M. Comte recommends towards a cherished memory or an ennobling ideal, when they come unprompted from the depths of the individual feeling. But there is something ineffably ludicrous in enjoining that everybody shall practise them 3 times daily for a period of 2 hours, not because his feelings require them, but for the premeditated purpose of getting his feelings up. The ludicrous, however, in any of its shapes, is a phenomenon with which M. Comte seems to have been totally unacquainted. There is nothing in his writings from which it could be inferred that he knew of the existence of such things as wit and humour. The only writer distinguished for either, of whom he shows any admiration, is Molière, and him he admires not for his wit but for his wisdom. We notice this without intending any reflection on M. Comte, for a profound conviction raises a person above the feeling of ridicule. But there are passages in his writings which, it really seems to us, could have been written by no man who had ever laughed. We will give one of these instances. Besides the regular prayers, M. Comte's religion, like the Catholic, has need of forms which can be applied to casual and unforeseen occasions. These, he says, must in general be left to the believer's own choice, but he suggests, as a very suitable one, the repetition of the fundamental formula of Positivism, viz., l'amour pour principe, l'ordre pour base, et le progrès pour but. Not content, however, with an equivalent for the Paters and Aves of Catholicism, he must have one for the sign of the cross also, and he thus delivers himself. Footnote: Système de politique positive, 4 100. End footnote. Cette expansion peut être perfectionnée par des signes universels afin de mieux développer l'aptitude nécessaire de la formule positiviste à représenter toujours la condition humaine. Il convient ordinairement de l'énoncer en touchant successivement les principaux organes que la théorie cérébrale assigne à ces 3 éléments. This may be a very appropriate mode of expressing one's devotion to the grand être, but any one who had appreciated its effect on the profane reader would have thought it judicious to keep it back till a considerably more advanced stage in the propagation of the positive religion. As M. Comte's religion has a cultus, so also it has a clergy, who are the pivot of his entire social and political system. Their nature and office will be best shown by describing his ideal of political society in its normal state, with the various classes of which it is composed. End of Part 2b. Recording by Bill Borst. Part 2c of Auguste Comte and Positivism. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Auguste Comte and Positivism, by John Stuart Mill. Part 2c. The necessity of a spiritual power, distinct and separate from the temporal government, is the essential principle of M. Comte's political scheme, as it may well be, since the spiritual power is the only counterpoise he provides or tolerates to the absolute dominion of the civil rulers. Nothing can exceed his combined detestation and contempt for government by assemblies, and for parliamentary or representative institutions in any form. They are an expedient, in his opinion, only suited to a state of transition, and even that nowhere but in England. The attempt to naturalize them in France, or any continental nation, he regards as mischievous quackery. Louis Napoleon's usurpation is absolved, is made laudable to him, because it overthrew a representative government. Election of superiors by inferiors, except as a revolutionary expedient, is an abomination in his sight. Public functionaries of all kinds should name their successors, subject to the approbation of their own superiors, and giving public notice of the nomination so long beforehand as to admit of discussion, and the timely revocation of a wrong choice. But by the side of the temporal rulers he places another authority, with no power to command, but only to advise and remonstrate. The family being in his mind, as in that of Frenchmen generally, the foundation and essential type of all society, the separation of the two powers commences there. The spiritual, or moral and religious power, in a family, is the women of it. The Positivist family is composed of the fundamental couple, their children, and the parents of the man, if alive. The whole government of the household, except as regards the education of the children, resides in the man; and even over that he has complete power, but should forbear to exert it. The part assigned to the women is to improve the man through his affections, and to bring up the children, who, until the age of 14, at which scientific instruction begins, are to be educated wholly by their mother. That women may be better fitted for these functions, they are peremptorily excluded from all others. No woman is to work for her living. Every woman is to be supported by her husband or her male relations, and if she has none of these, by the state. She is to have no powers of government, even domestic, and no property. Her legal rights of inheritance are preserved to her, that her feelings of duty may make her voluntarily forego them. There are to be no marriage portions, that women may no longer be sought in marriage from interested motives. Marriages are to be rigidly indissoluble, except for a single cause. It is remarkable that the bitterest enemy of divorce among all philosophers nevertheless allows it, in a case which the laws of England, and of other countries reproached by him with tolerating divorce, do not admit; namely, when one of the parties has been sentenced to an infamizing punishment, involving loss of civil rights. It is monstrous that condemnation, even for life, to a felon's punishment, should leave an unhappy victim bound to, and in the wife's case under the legal authority of, the culprit. M. Comte could feel for the injustice in this special case, because it chanced to be the unfortunate situation of his Clotilde. Minor degrees of unworthiness may entitle the innocent party to a legal separation, but without the power of remarriage. Second marriages, indeed, are not permitted by the positive religion. There is to be no impediment to them by law, but morality is to condemn them, and every couple who are married religiously as well as civilly are to make a vow of eternal widowhood, le veuvage éternel. This absolute monogamy is, in M. Comte's opinion, essential to the complete fusion between two beings, which is the essence of marriage. And moreover, eternal constancy is required by the posthumous adoration, which is to be continuously paid by the survivor to one who, though objectively dead, still lives subjectively. The domestic spiritual power, which resides in the women of the family, is chiefly concentrated in the most venerable of them, the husband's mother, while alive. It has an auxiliary in the influence of age, represented by the husband's father, who is supposed to have passed the period of retirement from active life, fixed by M. Comte, for he fixes everything, at 63, at which age the head of the family gives up the reins of authority to his son, retaining only a consultative voice. This domestic spiritual power, being principally moral, and confined to a private life, requires the support and guidance of an intellectual power exterior to it, the sphere of which will naturally be wider, extending also to public life. This consists of the clergy, or priesthood, for M. Comte is fond of borrowing the consecrated expressions of Catholicism to denote the nearest equivalents which his own system affords. The clergy are the theoretic or philosophical class, and are supported by an endowment from the state, voted periodically, but administered by themselves. Like women, they are to be excluded from all riches, and from all participation in power, except the absolute power of each over his own household. They are neither to inherit nor to receive emolument from any of their functions, or from their writings or teachings of any description, but are to live solely on their small salaries. This M. Comte deems necessary to the complete disinterestedness of their counsel. To have the confidence of the masses, they must, like the masses, be poor. Their exclusion from political and from all other practical occupations is indispensable for the same reason, and for others equally peremptory. Those occupations are, he contends, incompatible with the habits of mind necessary to philosophers. A practical position, either private or public, chains the mind to specialities and details, while a philosopher's business is with general truths and connected views, vue d'ensemble. These, again, require an habitual abstraction from details, which unfits the mind for judging well and rapidly of individual cases. The same person cannot be both a good theorist and a good practitioner or ruler, though practitioners and rulers ought to have a solid theoretic education. The two kinds of function must be absolutely exclusive of one another. To attempt them both is inconsistent with fitness for either. But as men may mistake their vocation, up to the age of 35 they are allowed to change their career. To the clergy is entrusted the theoretic or scientific instruction of youth. The medical art also is to be in their hands, since no one is fit to be a physician who does not study and understand the whole man, moral as well as physical. M. Comte has a contemptuous opinion of the existing race of physicians, who, he says, deserve no higher name than that of veterinaires, since they concern themselves with man only in his animal and not in his human character. In his last years, M. Comte, as we learn from Dr. Robinet's volume, indulged in the wildest speculations on medical science, declaring all maladies to be one and the same disease, the disturbance or destruction of l'unité cérébrale. The other functions of the clergy are moral, much more than intellectual. They are the spiritual directors and venerated advisers of the active or practical classes, including the political. They are the mediators, in all social differences, between labourers, for instance, and their employers. They are to advise and admonish on all important violations of the moral law. Especially, it devolves on them to keep the rich and powerful to the performance of their moral duties towards their inferiors. If private remonstrance fails, public denunciation is to follow. In extreme cases they may proceed to the length of excommunication, which, though it only operates through opinion, yet, if it carries opinion with it, may, as M. Comte complacently observes, be of such powerful efficacy, that the richest man may be driven to produce his subsistence by his own manual labour, through the impossibility of inducing any other person to work for him. In this, as in all other cases, the priesthood depends for its authority on carrying with it the mass of the people, those who, possessing no accumulations, live on the wages of daily labour, popularly but incorrectly termed the working classes, and by French writers, in their Roman law phraseology, proletaires. These, therefore, who are not allowed the smallest political rights, are incorporated into the spiritual power, of which they form, after women and the clergy, the third element. It remains to give an account of the temporal power, composed of the rich and the employers of labour, two classes who, in M. Comte's system, are reduced to one, for he allows of no idle rich. A life made up of mere amusement and self-indulgence, though not interdicted by law, is to be deemed so disgraceful, that nobody with the smallest sense of shame would choose to be guilty of it. Here, we think, M. Comte has lighted on a true principle, towards which the tone of opinion in modern Europe is more and more tending, and which is destined to be one of the constitutive principles of regenerated society. We believe, for example, with him, that in the future there will be no class of landlords living at ease on their rents, but every landlord will be a capitalist trained to agriculture, himself superintending and directing the cultivation of his estate. No one but he who guides the work should have the control of the tools. In M. Comte's system, the rich, as a rule, consist of the captains of industry. But the rule is not entirely without exception, for M. Comte recognizes other useful modes of employing riches. In particular, one of his favourite ideas is that of an order of chivalry, composed of the most generous and self-devoted of the rich, voluntarily dedicating themselves, like knights errant of old, to the redressing of wrongs and the protection of the weak and oppressed. He remarks that oppression in modern life can seldom reach or even venture to attack the life or liberty of its victims (he forgets the case of domestic tyranny), but only their pecuniary means, and it is therefore by the purse chiefly that individuals can usefully interpose, as they formerly did by the sword. The occupation, however, of nearly all the rich will be the direction of labour, and for this work they will be educated. Reciprocally, it is in M. Comte's opinion essential that all directors of labour should be rich. Capital, in which he includes land, should be concentrated in a few holders, so that every capitalist may conduct the most extensive operations which one mind is capable of superintending. This is not only demanded by good economy, in order to take the utmost advantage of a rare kind of practical ability, but it necessarily follows from the principle of M. Comte's scheme, which regards a capitalist as a public functionary. M. Comte's conception of the relation of capital to society is essentially that of Socialists, but he would bring about by education and opinion what they aim at effecting by positive institution. The owner of capital is by no means to consider himself its absolute proprietor. Legally, he is not to be controlled in his dealings with it, for power should be in proportion to responsibility. But it does not belong to him for his own use. He is merely entrusted by society with a portion of the accumulations made by the past providence of mankind, to be administered for the benefit of the present generation and of posterity, under the obligation of preserving them unimpaired, and handing them down, more or less augmented, to our successors. He is not entitled to dissipate them, or divert them from the service of humanity to his own pleasures, nor has he a moral right to consume on himself the whole even of his profits. He is bound in conscience, if they exceed his reasonable wants, to employ the surplus in improving either the efficiency of his operations, or the physical and mental condition of his labourers. The portion of his gains which he may appropriate to his own use must be decided by himself, under accountability to opinion, and opinion ought not to look very narrowly into the matter, nor hold him to a rigid reckoning for any moderate indulgence of luxury or ostentation, since under the great responsibilities that will be imposed on him, the position of an employer of labour will be so much less desirable to any one in whom the instincts of pride and vanity are not strong, than the heureuse insouciance of a labourer, that those instincts must be to a certain degree indulged, or no one would undertake the office. With this limitation, every employer is a mere administrator of his possessions, for his work-people and for society at large. If he indulges himself lavishly, without reserving an ample remuneration for all who are employed under him, he is morally culpable, and will incur sacerdotal admonition. This state of things necessarily implies that capital should be in few hands, because, as M. Comte observes, without great riches the obligations which society ought to impose could not be fulfilled without an amount of personal abnegation that it would be hopeless to expect. If a person is conspicuously qualified for the conduct of an industrial enterprise, but destitute of the fortune necessary for undertaking it, M. Comte recommends that he should be enriched by subscription, or in cases of sufficient importance by the state. Small landed proprietors and capitalists, and the middle classes altogether, he regards as a parasitic growth, destined to disappear, the best of the body becoming large capitalists, and the remainder proletaires. Society will consist only of rich and poor, and it will be the business of the rich to make the best possible lot for the poor. The remuneration of the labourers will continue, as at present, to be a matter of voluntary arrangement between them and their employers, the last resort on either side being refusal of co-operation, refus de concours. In other words, a strike or a lock-out, with the sacerdotal order for mediators in case of need. But though wages are to be an affair of free contract, their standard is not to be the competition of the market, but the application of the products in equitable proportion between the wants of the labourers and the wants and dignity of the employer. As it is one of M. Comte's principles that a question cannot be usefully proposed without an attempt at a solution, he gives his ideas from the beginning as to what the normal income of a labouring family should be. They are on such a scale that until some great extension shall have taken place in the scientific resources of mankind, it is no wonder he thinks it necessary to limit as much as possible the number of those who are to be supported by what is left of the produce. In the first place, the labourer's dwelling, which is to consist of 7 rooms, is, with all that it contains, to be his own property. It is the only landed property he is allowed to possess. But every family should be the absolute owner of all things which are destined for its exclusive use. Lodging being thus independently provided for, and education and medical attendance being secured gratuitously by the general arrangements of society, the pay of the labourer is to consist of 2 portions, the one monthly and of fixed amount, the other weekly and proportioned to the produce of his labour. The former M. Comte fixes at 100 francs (£4) for a month of 28 days, being £52 a year, and the rate of piecework should be such as to make the other part amount to an average of 7 francs (5s. 6d.) per working day. Agreeably to M. Comte's rule, that every public functionary should appoint his successor, the capitalist has unlimited power of transmitting his capital by gift or bequest after his own death or retirement. In general, it will be best bestowed entire upon one person, unless the business will advantageously admit of subdivision. He will naturally leave it to one or more of his sons, if sufficiently qualified, and rightly so, hereditary being, in M. Comte's opinion, preferable to acquired wealth, as being usually more generously administered. But merely as his sons they have no moral right to it. M. Comte here recognizes another of the principles on which we believe that the constitution of regenerated society will rest. He maintains, as others in the present generation have done, that the father owes nothing to his son except a good education, and pecuniary aid sufficient for an advantageous start in life; that he is entitled, and may be morally bound, to leave the bulk of his fortune to some other properly selected person or persons, whom he judges likely to make a more beneficial use of it. This is the first of 3 important points, in which M. Comte's theory of the family, wrong as we deem it in its foundations, is in advance of prevailing theories and existing institutions. The second is the reintroduction of adoption, not only in default of children, but to fulfil the purposes and satisfy the sympathetic wants to which such children as there are may happen to be inadequate. The third is a most important point, the incorporation of domestics as substantive members of the family. There is hardly any part of the present constitution of society more essentially vicious, and morally injurious to both parties, than the relation between masters and servants. To make this a really human and a moral relation is one of the principal desiderata in social improvement. The feeling of the vulgar of all classes that domestic service has anything in it peculiarly mean, is a feeling than which there is none meaner. In the feudal ages, youthful nobles of the highest rank thought themselves honoured by officiating in what is now called a menial capacity, about the persons of superiors of both sexes, for whom they felt respect. And as M. Comte observes, there are many families who can in no other way so usefully serve humanity as by ministering to the bodily wants of other families, called to functions which require the devotion of all their thoughts. We will add, by way of supplement to M. Comte's doctrine, that much of the daily physical work of a household, even in opulent families, if silly notions of degradation common to all ranks did not interfere, might very advantageously be performed by the family itself, at least by its younger members, to whom it would give healthful exercise of the bodily powers, which has now to be sought in modes far less useful, and also a familiar acquaintance with the real work of the world, and a moral willingness to take their share of its burthens, which, in the great majority of the better-off classes, do not now get cultivated at all. We have still to speak of the directly political functions of the rich, or, as M. Comte terms them, the patriciate. The entire political government is to be in their hands. First, however, the existing nations are to be broken up into small republics, the largest not exceeding the size of Belgium, Portugal, or Tuscany, any larger nationalities being incompatible with the unity of wants and feelings, which is required not only to give due strength to the sentiment of patriotism, always strongest in small states, but to prevent undue compression. For no territory, M. Comte thinks, can without oppression be governed from a distant centre. Algeria, therefore, is to be given up to the Arabs, Corsica to its inhabitants, and France proper is to be, before the end of the century, divided into 17 republics, corresponding to the number of considerable towns. Paris, however, need it be said, succeeding to Rome as the religious metropolis of the world. Ireland, Scotland, and Wales are to be separated from England, which is of course to detach itself from all its transmarine dependencies. In each state thus constituted, the powers of government are to be vested in a triumvirate of the three principal bankers, who are to take the foreign, home, and financial departments respectively. How they are to conduct the government and remain bankers does not clearly appear, but it must be intended that they should combine both offices, for they are to receive no pecuniary remuneration for the political one. Their power is to amount to a dictatorship, M. Comte's own word, and he is hardly justified in saying that he gives political power to the rich, since he gives it over the rich and every one else to three individuals of the number not even chosen by the rest, but named by their predecessors. As a check on the dictators, there is to be complete freedom of speech, writing, printing, and voluntary association, and all important acts of the government, except in cases of emergency, are to be announced sufficiently long beforehand to ensure ample discussion. This, and the influences of the spiritual power, are the only guarantees provided against misgovernment. When we consider that the complete dominion of every nation of mankind is thus handed over to only 4 men, for the spiritual power is to be under the absolute and undivided control of a single pontiff for the whole human race, one is appalled at the picture of entire subjugation and slavery, which is recommended to us as the last and highest result of the evolution of humanity. But the conception rises to the terrific, when we are told the mode in which the single high priest of humanity is intended to use his authority. It is the most warning example we know into what frightful aberrations a powerful and comprehensive mind may be led by the exclusive following out of a single idea. The single idea of M. Comte on this subject is that the intellect should be wholly subordinated to the feelings, or, to translate the meaning out of sentimental into logical language, that the exercise of the intellect, as of all our other faculties, should have for its sole object the general good. Every other employment of it should be accounted not only idle and frivolous, but morally culpable. Being indebted wholly to humanity for the cultivation to which we owe our mental powers, we are bound in return to consecrate them wholly to her service. Having made up his mind that this ought to be, there is with M. Comte but one step to concluding that the Grand Pontiff of humanity must take care that it shall be, and on this foundation he organizes an elaborate system for the total suppression of all independent thought. He does not, indeed, invoke the arm of the law, or call for any prohibitions. The clergy are to have no monopoly. Any one else may cultivate science if he can, may write and publish if he can find readers, may give private instruction if anybody consents to receive it. But since the sacerdotal body will absorb into itself all but those whom it deems either intellectually or morally unequal to the vocation, all rival teachers will, as he calculates, be so discredited beforehand, that their competition will not be formidable. Within the body itself, the high priest has it in his power to make sure that there shall be no opinions, and no exercise of mind, but such as he approves, for he alone decides the duties and local residence of all its members, and can even eject them from the body. Before electing to be under this rule, we feel a natural curiosity to know in what manner it is to be exercised. Humanity has only yet had one pontiff, whose mental qualifications for the post are not likely to be often surpassed, M. Comte himself. It is of some importance to know what are the ideas of this high priest concerning the moral and religious government of the human intellect. One of the doctrines which M. Comte most strenuously enforces in his later writings is that, during the preliminary evolution of humanity, terminated by the foundation of Positivism, the free development of our forces of all kinds was the important matter, but that from this time forward the principal need is to regulate them. Formerly the danger was of their being insufficient, but henceforth of their being abused. Let us express in passing our entire dissent from this doctrine. Whoever thinks that the wretched education which mankind as yet receive calls forth their mental powers, except those of a select few, in a sufficient or even tolerable degree, must be very easily satisfied; and the abuse of them, far from becoming proportionally greater as knowledge and mental capacity increase, becomes rapidly less, provided always that the diffusion of those qualities keeps pace with their growth. The abuse of intellectual power is only to be dreaded when society is divided between a few highly cultivated intellects and an ignorant and stupid multitude. But mental power is a thing which M. Comte does not want, or wants infinitely less than he wants submission and obedience. Of all the ingredients of human nature, he continually says, the intellect most needs to be disciplined and reined in. It is the most turbulent, le plus perturbateur, of all the mental elements, more so than even the selfish instincts. Throughout the whole modern transition, beginning with ancient Greece, for M. Comte tells us that we have always been in a state of revolutionary transition since then, the intellect has been in a state of systematic insurrection against le coeur. The metaphysicians and literati (lettrés), after helping to pull down the old religion and social order, are rootedly hostile to the construction of the new, and desiring only to prolong the existing scepticism and intellectual anarchy, which secure to them a cheap social ascendancy, without the labour of earning it by solid scientific preparation. The scientific class, from whom better might have been expected, are, if possible, worse. Void of enlarged views, despising all that is too large for their comprehension, devoted exclusively each to his special science, contemptuously indifferent to moral and political interests, their sole aim is to acquire an easy reputation, and in France, through paid academies and professorships, personal lucre, by pushing their sciences into idle and useless inquiries, spéculations oiseuses, of no value to the real interests of mankind, and tending to divert the thoughts from them. One of the duties most incumbent on opinion and on the spiritual power is to stigmatize as immoral and effectually suppress these useless employments of the speculative faculties. All exercise of thought should be abstained from, which has not some beneficial tendency, some actual utility to mankind. M. Comte, of course, is not the man to say that it must be a merely material utility. If a speculation, though it has no doctrinal, has a logical value, if it throws any light on universal method, it is still more deserving of cultivation than if its usefulness was merely practical. But, either as method or as doctrine, it must bring forth fruits to humanity, otherwise it is not only contemptible, but criminal. End of Part 2c. Recording by Bill Borst.